Imagine, the year is 1958 in Central Point, Virginia. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you and your spouse are sound asleep in bed. Suddenly you hear a commotion, and you're startled awake by a blinding flashlight aimed right in your face. You try to move away, but you're pulled out of bed and thrown into handcuffs. You ask why this is happening, and the person who finally identifies himself as the sheriff says, "What are you doing in bed with this woman?" To which your spouse responds, "I'm his wife." You're both taken from your home, you spend the night in jail and pay a $1,000 fine. Your wife spends the next 3 days in jail, and when you're both released after pleading guilty, you're given the option to leave the state of Virginia for at least 25 years or serve 1 year in jail. This is the story of Mildred and Richard Loving. This aptly named case of Loving v. Virginia is a story about an interracial couple whose only crime was, ironically, loving each other. This landmark case forced state and federal courts to reevaluate the ethics and legality of state-established anti-miscegenation laws and re-examine how those laws violate the 14th Amendment. First, let's examine what anti-miscegenation means. Here to help me explain that is the not-so-honorable Judge Kim Crow. Anti-miscegenation laws are laws that enforce racial segregation by criminalizing interracial marriage and or intimate relations between mixed races. America has had a lengthy and sordid history of anti-miscegenation laws, beginning in 1661 when, yes, you guessed it, Virginia became one of the first states to acknowledge slavery in its laws by enacting the anti-miscegenation laws. Here to help me explain how slavery and anti-miscegenation laws became intertwined is the incredibly passionate Miss Rebecca Rand. Okay, so it comes down to control, man. You see, back then, slaves were more like chattel than anything else. It wasn't bad enough that they did backbreaking work from sunup until sundown for free and were indentured to their masters forever. No, that wasn't good enough. We had to create laws to ensure that they knew their place. So, while a white slave master could legally rape, beat, starve, or even kill a slave because they were considered his property, laws like Virginia's anti-miscegenation law were created to ensure that slaves understood the clear line between master and slave. By 1780, nearly 100 years later, Pennsylvania repealed the law banning interracial marriage. And by 1843, another 60 years later, Massachusetts became the second state to do so. In 1883, another 40 years later, anti-miscegenation laws were finally challenged in the case of Pace v. Alabama. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that state-level anti-miscegenation laws did not violate the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Believe it or not, this ruling held for 80 years. This brings us to the early 1960s, where an interracial couple identified only as McLaughlin chose to live together because they weren't allowed to get married in the state of Florida. The couple was arrested under fornication charges, citing Florida Statute 798.05. Any Negro man or white woman, or any white man and Negro woman who are not married to each other, who habitually live in or occupy in the nighttime the same room, shall each be punished by imprisonment not exceeding 12 months or by a fine not exceeding $500. The central question at the heart of McLaughlin v. Florida was simple. Can an interracial couple be subjected to race-contingent fornication charges? Seriously? Fornication charges? Race-contingent fornication charges. You just have to ask yourself who comes up with this stuff. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that laws banning interracial sex violate the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And while the law didn't exactly address interracial marriage, it laid the groundwork for the monumental case of Loving v. Virginia. This brings us back to Mildred and Richard Loving. Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred Loving, a Native American and African American woman, were married in Washington, D.C. However, they returned to Virginia to live as husband and wife. This violated the Commonwealth's anti-miscegenation law, as well as Virginia's own Racial Integrity Act. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 expanded the scope of Virginia's ban on interracial marriage by criminalizing all marriages between white persons and non-white persons. Oh, Virginia, you crazy state. So back to the Racial Integrity Act. The Racial Integrity Act. Are you kidding me? There was absolutely no integrity in this act. It was nothing more than a state-level attempt to protect whiteness. Arrested on July 11th of 1958, the Lovings agreed to leave Virginia for 25 years in exchange for a suspended sentence. They would spend the next 9 years in exile. In the background of the Loving struggle is the civil rights movement, and they see others struggling and demonstrating in protest, and by this they become inspired. Eventually, Mildred musters up the courage to write to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy to ask for help. Kennedy responds and tells her to contact the American Civil Liberties Union, which she does, and ACLU lawyers Bernard S. Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf take the case. Their first step at justice was to have their original case vacated and the ruling reversed by their original judge. After nearly a year of waiting, they brought a class action lawsuit to the U.S. District Court of Eastern District, Virginia. This received a swift response from Judge Bazile. Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangements, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. Interference with his arrangements. You mean like capturing a race of people, stripping them from their families, putting them in shackles, taking them against their will to another country, and making them your slaves for life? You mean like that kind of interference? This heinously biased response from the judge provided the grounds for an appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, but the court upheld the original ruling. Eventually, the United States Supreme Court granted certiorari, and oral arguments began on April 10th of 1967. The issue posed: is a state law prohibiting marriage exclusively on the basis of race constitutional under the 14th Amendment? Neither of the Lovings appeared in court. Only two novice lawyers who would argue one of the most epic constitutional law cases in the history of our country. In a unanimous decision handed down on June 12th of 1967, the Supreme Court voted to overturn Pace v. Alabama, ruling in Loving v. Virginia that state bans on interracial marriage violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, making interracial marriage legal throughout all of the United States. Laws banning interracial marriage were deemed unconstitutional and overturned in 16 states, though Alabama wouldn't repeal its anti-miscegenation laws until 2000. The Supreme Court held that the state interracial marriage bans violate both Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. In doing so, the court applied strict scrutiny. To pass strict scrutiny, a law's use of racial classifications must be necessary to further a compelling state of interest and be narrowly tailored to further that interest. On the equal protection issue, Virginia contended that a more differential rational analysis should apply because the statute punishes members of both races equally. The court rejected this argument, noting that the law only forbade interracial marriages involving white people. The court determined that the statute drew a racial classification on its face, thus warranting strict scrutiny. Applying strict scrutiny, the court ruled that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law, based entirely on racial distinctions, could serve no other purpose than to perpetuate racial discrimination. The court concluded that the law had been created to further white supremacy. Further, the court reasoned that the restriction on freedoms to marry violated the principal purpose of the Equal Protection Clause, which was to eliminate state discrimination. In addition to invalidating the statute on equal protection grounds, the court also held that the law violated the Loving's due process rights. Emphasizing the long-standing importance of the individual right to marry, the court held an individual's choice to marry may not be invaded by the state. Accordingly, the court reversed the judgment of the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals and overturned the Loving's convictions. Justice Stewart wrote separately as to emphasize his belief that laws criminalizing behavior only when perpetuated by a member of a particular race are repugnant to the Constitution. The final ruling read, "Under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with that individual and cannot be infringed by the state. These convictions must be reversed." It took 9 long years, but the Lovings were finally able to go back to their home in Virginia, together, legally, as husband and wife. The Loving case was a major step forward in the civil rights movement. The court's ruling invalidated interracial marriage bans in 16 states. The ruling also affirmed the importance of personal choice and the exercise of the freedom to marry. Nearly half a century later, the court invoked its decision in Loving as a binding precedent to extend marriage equality to same-sex couples in the landmark case of Obergefell v. Hodges, citing the fundamental nature of the right to marriage. The court affirmed in Obergefell that which had been first decided by Loving. Love wins. Love wins. Love wins.